Brothers and sisters, we're very privileged today to be with Steve Druker, and Steve is an expert on the legal aspects of genetically modified organisms, and he's just published a best-selling, controversial book that has received so much comment and so many magnificent reviews. Steve has just published a magnificent best-selling book called Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, and it's published by the Clear River Press. And Steve spoken just now, just a few days ago, at the Soil Not Oil Conference, an international conference, just north of Berkeley here in Richmond, California. And he's just come back from the heirloom vegetable conference in Santa Rosa, California. At both conferences, as I say, he spoke to an enthralled, packed audience. So we're very, very privileged today indeed to be speaking with Steve. And Steve, if you could give us a little, or clue us in a little, of your background and how you first became interested in this very convoluted and involved and exceedingly important topic of genetically modified foods.
I'm a public interest attorney, and I've been interested in good health and in healthful food for a long time. And in early 1996, I began to learn the facts about this massive venture to reconfigure the genetic core of the world's food supply. And the more I learned, the more I became concerned, because it became very apparent that there's a great gap between the promotional claims being made about genetically engineered foods and the actual facts. And I was also very concerned that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, had made a blanket presumption that these foods could be presumed safe and that they could be marketed, and that they were being marketed without the requirement for one iota of testing, safety testing from the FDA, and even without labels to inform the consumers about the genetic reconfiguration that had occurred. And I was very concerned about this because it had become clear that there were good reasons to regard GMOs with a watchful eye, that there were good reasons to be concerned. Many scientists, independent scientists, have been bringing forth reasons why these foods entail a different level of risk from conventional foods. And it seemed that the FDA should not be doing what it was doing. It was an irresponsible policy, that it seemed unscientific as well, unethical. And I had a hunch it was illegal, and as I did more research, that hunch was confirmed. It turns out the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, in its zeal to promote biotechnology, has actually allowed the genetically engineered foods on our market in stark violation of U.S. food safety law.
In stark violation. So that's amazing. I think it's an amazing thing, in my humble opinion, to enlist 350 million guinea pigs, because that's indeed what it comes down to, in the largest biological experiment that has ever, of all time.
Right.
And most important of all is simply dismissing any reservations as to food safety, with a wave of a hand saying they are not substantially different.
Yeah, and
they're not substantially different, and that's the end of it.
And they had to lie to do that because, Jesse, I brought a lawsuit against the FDA, and as a result of the lawsuit, the FDA was forced to turn over more than 44,000 pages of their internal files relevant to their policy on GMOs. And it was clear from there that their own scientists, who were put on a biotechnology task force, scientists from all the major divisions within the USA that needed to weigh in on the issue. The memos, the conclusions in the memos were very clear. Consistently, the conclusions from the various divisions were genetic engineering is different than traditional breeding. It entails different risks. Its products cannot be presumed safe. Each one should be carefully safety tested before it's marketed. Now, that's what the FDA scientists were saying is necessary from the perspective of science. That's also what the law requires. So the FDA scientists were essentially telling their superiors, look, what the law requires is also sound and necessary from the standpoint of science. So from both the perspective of what the law demands and what sound science requires, the FDA superiors, administrators, knew that GMOs have to be tested. What did they do? They covered up all of the warnings from their own scientists and they lied about it. They stated in public that they weren't aware of any information showing that genetically engineered foods differ in any uniform or meaningful way from other foods. Hard to believe that statement is true, that they didn't have information when their files are full of information from their own scientists. And then they allowed these foods to come out without any marketing, even though, as I've said, and it bears repeating, that the U.S. food safety laws are quite strict, actually, and they require foods with new additives, like these GMO foods, to be demonstrated safe before they're marketed. And the FDA has violated the law and let these foods on the market without the requirement for any testing at all. It's a great travesty, and one of the biggest frauds ever pulled off by, I think, an agency of a democratic government.
That's amazing, and it's and also even more astonishing is, in contrast with this, is the restraint and reservation shown by European governments, proceeding for the most part in a much more cautious and conservative manner towards this this innovation that is without precedent in all of human history.
Right.
So instead of taking the usual cautious steps, they simply went all out and leapfrogged or dismissed or bypassed the usual scientific safeguards.
That's right. But actually, I need to make a point. Whereas you're correct that Europe has exercised more caution than the U.S., it doesn't take much caution to be better than we are, since the FDA has thrown caution completely to the winds. Unfortunately, the European regulators, the European Food Safety Agency and the government, various regulators there have actually been quite lax. The European Union is supposed to be following the precautionary principle when it comes to food, and they have not really followed that principle in the case of GMOs. So there are many instances, and my book documents this, in which the European food safety authorities are actually quite lax too, and GMOs have been approved for the market that never should have, based on very shoddy tests. It's also important, Jesse, to emphasize that it was only up until a few years ago, I believe it wasn't until 2013 that the European Union was requiring actual toxicological feeding studies. Before then it was analytical chemical analyses, which are not at all adequate. But even the tests that they are now requiring are far too short. They're at most 90 days. Well, those are only medium-term tests. And theory and practice have both shown that there have to be at least 2-year long-term studies to make sure that any problems are being caught. So it's lax testing everywhere in the world. It's just the U.S. takes the cake as the most irresponsible of all the nations in the world, even though we have the strongest food safety laws.
And even though we have the strongest food safety laws for sure, and what do you, just in general terms, these things just don't happen spontaneously.
No.
What were the dynamics behind this decision?
The history is interesting and actually troubling, because and my book presents the history, and we can see that from the beginning of the genetic engineering revolution, even before there was a biotechnology industry, the university scientists and research institute scientists who wanted to employ genetic engineering in doing research, and they were trying to do it for a good cause for the most part, for medical purposes, they were afraid of getting regulated. They didn't want to be regulated. They also understood there were great risks in doing what they were doing, and they didn't want to scare the public. They didn't want to have regulations come down on them. So they basically claimed and convinced enough people that they could govern themselves. But in order to keep regulation off of them, they basically had to pull some shenanigans. And it hasn't been actually a pretty chapter in the history of science. So at every step of the way, as genetic engineering grew, the venture became increasingly dependent on disinformation and other forms of untruth. And it's gotten to the point where many of the proponents can't even discriminate truth from reality, truth from falsehood. I think they seem to believe their own propaganda. But the hands-off policy, the promotional policy on the part of the federal executive agencies really started in a strong way in 1986 during the Reagan presidency, when a joint coordinated framework came out, a directive from the White House telling them to regulate genetically engineered foods within existing regulatory framework, no new regulations, there wouldn't be any new laws, and the idea was to promote genetic engineering as much as possible. And that directive has pretty much been in force in every successive White House, whether Democrat or Republican.
We see time and time again, as a counter to what you're saying, and we've seen this just now in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that appeared just a couple days ago, where it is claimed that there is no scientific evidence that GMOs are harmful. The Wall Street Journal puts this out continuously.
And it's interesting, by making that claim, they are actually tacitly admitting they're on the market illegally, because according to US law, even if there was no evidence that they're harmful, which by the way isn't true, but let's just assume for the sake of argument, to humor them, there's not one smidgen, assume that there's not one bit of evidence demonstrating harm. That isn't sufficient. If that was all there is, they're on the market illegally, because US food safety law requires a positive demonstration of safety. So the burden of proof is squarely on the shoulders of the manufacturers to demonstrate that each and every genetically engineered food is safe. And when they claim no evidence of harm, it just shows they don't have sufficient evidence of safety. But there is extensive evidence that indicates that one or another GMO has been harmful to laboratory animals. Those are solid studies. They've been published in peer-reviewed journals. And there is more than enough reason to regard all genetically engineered foods as unreasonably risky. And the Royal Society of Canada, that nation's premier health scientific organization, came out with a long report stating that it's scientifically unjustified to presume that GMOs are safe, and that every one of them should be regarded with the default presumption that unintended perturbations, unintended disruptions have occurred that could have made that food toxic or allergenic or otherwise harmful.
One thing that particularly concerns me, and many others also, is the fact that first of all, they're finding that GMOs survive the digestion process in the stomach and actually enter, and they have been detected in the bloodstream. So and therefore the conjecture has occurred there, or the conjecture has occurred that maybe these genetically modified organisms as they exist and continue to exist in the bloodstream, are quite capable of manufacturing the same toxins and the same toxins and the same chemicals and whatever as they were initially designed to do. And this is a rather disturbing and unsettling prospect, to say the least, that they're actually going to work inside you.
Yeah, and there are concerns about the extent to which the expression products of the genes might be surviving.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every prediction, every claim that was made initially about why these foods would be safe, most of them have been discredited. But they keep saying they're safe, even though it's clear they didn't understand. There's been a deficient, this technology was brought out on a very superficial and quite deficient understanding of how the genomes, what genomes are and how they operate. And that's become increasingly clear year by year. And yet they continue to basically boast about how safe these are, even though their theoretical base keeps eroding, and that empirically more and more are found to have created something strange going on, and it's not a good situation at all.
And also there's another aspect of this, aside from the safety per se of GMOs. We'll leave that aside for a moment. Important as it may be, there's also another aspect to that without any doubt whatsoever. The advent of GMOs has meant a phenomenal increase in the tonnage of pesticides that are being used, and in particular with the amount of Roundup that is being applied. The tonnages involved are astonishing. And this is very poignant indeed, in that just a couple of days ago, just after the Wall Street Journal's editorial, within a day or two after the Wall Street Journal came out and saying that still there is no scientific evidence that they are harmful in any way, just after that, the state of California has issued a formal directive saying that Roundup is carcinogenic. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Now, have they said carcinogenic or probable carcinogen? I know the World Health Organization said probable, but whatever, that should be enough. And you're very correct. The majority of GMOs that have been planted have been specifically engineered to resist one or another herbicide. In some cases, several cases, more than one herbicide. Now, obviously, generally the herbicide manufacturer has also been the manufacturer of the seed, and the farmers don't really get to buy those seeds; they have to license them, the way we license an intellectual property such as software. And part of the license is they have to agree to only use the company who produced the seeds, that company's brand of herbicide on their crop, or they're in violation of the contract. That has increased, unsurprisingly, dramatically increased the amount of herbicide that's been sprayed on our fields, because prior to genetic engineering, in the case of most conventional crops, farmers could spray before the plant sprouted, but they couldn't spray once the plants had sprouted directly. They had to then just apply herbicide sparingly around the borders of the field. But if they'd sprayed directly on the plants, it would have killed them. When the plants have been engineered to resist the herbicide, then they can spray it right on the plants. Now, this is a major problem in itself, because especially because now it's classed as a possible carcinogen, probable carcinogen. When people eat the soy or the corn or whatever that's been sprayed, they're getting a very high level of herbicide, high relative to what the permissible limits had been, and what the situation is in organic or even non-GMO conventional. And so there's been a dramatic increase in the exposure, the load of herbicide that the average American is now carrying because of the genetic engineering. And it's not a good situation at all.
That's altogether tragic, given the pollution of the air, the water, the soil, and everything else, not to even mention electromagnetic pollution also. Right. So the entire environment is becoming more and more antithetical to life.
Right.
Antithetical to life. And here you have another level on top of all of that, and it's
right.
So we're putting ourselves into an incredible, dangerous situation.
It's important to emphasize that whereas the herbicides are problematic in themselves, the herbicide-resistant crops that have been created through recombinant DNA technology, so-called engineering, then there's those are ones that entail two different dimensions of risk, because besides the risk of increased herbicide residues on the plants that are going to be eaten, there's the basic underlying risk of that the genetic engineering was employed in creating those varieties. And again, we know from what the FDA scientists warned, from the report of the Royal Society of Canada, from the British Medical Association, that there are good reasons to believe that these foods entail high risks. And that's why the FDA experts, the experts with the Royal Society of Canada, were cautioning that there has to be strong toxicological safety testing before these foods get to the market. And that hasn't happened.
That is, I think this is a remarkable stage of development, and especially given the incidence, the epidemiology of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and of course cancer, and given the tremendous weight and overload of carcinogens, pesticides, and whatever, this is a tragedy that's unfolding right before our eyes. But I want to backtrack and we look at this at a somewhat broader perspective, if I may. And that is, it seems to me that if we look at this from a biblical perspective, if you will, the various genes, or the division of labor, and the division of labor between plants and the division of species and whatever, is a common human heritage. It's the heritage of all of us, of all of us. And just imagine the incredible arrogance, because that's what it is, that can take a species of an Arctic, that can take the genes of an Arctic eel and cross them with a salmon, for example, to produce, and the reason for this, instead of the salmon coming to a maturity in 3 years, as is normal, so it produces a super salmon that becomes mature in 1 year. So this is a remarkable state of affairs, because you have here, they have crossed the line. You're dealing with the common heritage of every single person on this planet, and what they have done is to privatize this, encapsulate this, and expropriate this for their own private and exceedingly limited purposes and ends. And so that's my perspective on all that, and I really wonder, I think we have come to an extraordinary juncture in this regard, and I'm so glad to see that just at this Soil Not Oil conference that we had here in Richmond, that some of the finest people of the planet showed up there, and there were so many people standing up clear and forthright and calling things as they are.
Right. Just to add to I think you used the term arrogant there, and there is the several religious people who understand what's going on, and several were plaintiffs in the lawsuit that I brought. They stated that they regarded the genetic engineering of our food supply as an arrogant trespass on the integrity of God's creation. And when one really understands what's going on, then, and if one does believe, have a traditional theistic outlook about our cosmos, then that's not hard to agree with at all from a traditional theistic perspective. And one of the things that is very troubling, and I've been emphasized this in the book and in talks that I give too, is that in order to try to make genetically engineered foods look good and safer, there's often been a drive on the part of the proponents to make traditional foods, natural foods, look safe and dangerous. And so they actually, they try to belittle in many ways or make people afraid of natural foods, the foods that many people regard as God-given foods. They try to make it seem like the natural processes are this wild, crazy, baseless, directionless thing that in which we're lucky if we don't get poisoned by eating natural foods. And they claim that natural foods, foods produced through conventional breeding, they can contain unusual novel toxins too, but they never can give an example of it. They always give examples that are not examples of new toxins. And we do know that genetic engineering can produce new toxins. So they're basically trying to pull nature down in order to make genetic engineering look safer. And I think it's a slander against nature.
It truly, truly is, because all of these things, like Indian corn, maize, or corn here in America, or pumpkins, or sunflowers, or whatever, have evolved here on this American earth for millennia, over a long, long, long process of sorting and shifting and whatever. So for people to go in here and to simply choose things out of, just in effect, it's the true people who are producing these things on such a very, very narrow and limited basis, because in a natural process, all things are being taken into account. The climate, the soil, the water, and the nutrients, and whatever, and all things are being taken into account over a long, long-term process with the broadest and highest perspective.
Right.
And to shorten and to abridge this process, and to delimit it to the requirements of stockholders, to tell the truth, and their short-term needs and whatever, is a remarkable development. It's the common heritage of every single American and every single person on the surface of this earth. And it has been expropriated and taken away from us.
Very well said.
Steve, I would like to thank you for your insight, for your courage, for your energy in carrying this through over so many, many years. And congratulations again on this magnificent new book, which is so much sought after and talked about. And I want to wish you every success and thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Steve, thank you for helping every single American and standing up for every single person on this planet. Thank you indeed.
Well, thank you.